In this special video, you'll discover why living close to your children in old age could be affecting your happiness and well-being more than you imagine, and how reconsidering your situation could transform your quality of life. You will be surprised by the latest revelation, but before we start, I want you to pay close attention to this story because it will be very important for you to understand the great lesson of this video. Mrs. Rosa, a 70-year-old widow, decided to move in with her daughter Lucia after the death of her husband. The idea of being close to his grandchildren and helping at home filled his heart with excitement. Who wouldn't want to be surrounded by loved ones in old age? The prospect of a shared family life seemed like a dream come true. Mrs. Rosa felt like she had won the lottery. Their days were filled with childish laughter, delicious smells in the kitchen, and the comforting feeling of being useful. This is life, he thought while preparing breakfast for his grandchildren. His daughter Lucia's house had become a paradise of intergenerational coexistence. The mornings passed between French toast and made-up stories. In the afternoons, Rosa enjoyed helping the little ones with their homework, reliving her days as a teacher. "Grandma, can you help me with math?" little Matteo asked, and she felt her heart melt. A recent study from Stanford University revealed that intergenerational cohabitation can increase happiness and sense of purpose in grandparents, and Rosa was experiencing it firsthand. She felt more vital than ever, as if she had discovered the fountain of youth in the smiles of his grandchildren. But you know what they say about things that seem too good to be true? Sometimes they are. And this is where our story takes an unexpected turn. One afternoon, while Rosa was preparing dinner, she overheard Lucia talking on the phone. "Mom is a blessing. I don't know what we would do without her." Rosa felt a surge of pride, but also a small pang of something she couldn't identify. Concern, perhaps. The philosopher Epicurus once said, "It is not that we have little time, but that we waste a lot." Rosa was beginning to feel like every minute of her day was busy. Where were those quiet moments to read a good book or just look out the window? Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The routine was established. Breakfast, homework, lunch, more homework, dinner. Rosa found herself thinking about her old apartment, about the freedom to decide what to do with her time. But she scolded herself. "How can I be so ungrateful? I have everything I ever wanted." One Sunday morning, while making Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes, because let's be honest, what grandma hasn't made that before? Rosa realized that she couldn't remember the last time she had slept in, or the last time she had gone out with her friends without worrying about getting back in time for dinner. Psychologist Erik Erikson spoke about the importance of maintaining autonomy in old age, but Rosa felt that her autonomy was being diluted in a mixture of family love and unspoken obligations. One night, after putting the children to bed, Rosa sat on the porch. She looked at the stars and asked herself, "Is this really what I want for the rest of my life?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, like a balloon lost in the night sky. The poet Robert Frost wrote, "Two roads diverged in a forest and I took the road less traveled by." Rosa wondered if she had taken the right path or if, in her desire to be the perfect grandmother, she had lost sight of her own path. Before we continue, if you find value in these videos, please subscribe and click the bell to stay updated. Mrs. Rosa began to notice subtle changes in her daily routine. What began as occasional visits to care for her grandchildren became a constant responsibility. Suddenly, she found herself changing diapers, preparing bottles, and running after little whirlwinds of energy. Sound familiar? You are not alone. Epictetus once said, "Time doesn't stand still, and neither does life." And boy, did Mrs. Rosa begin to feel the truth of these words. Her days, once filled with social activities and time for herself, were now completely busy with the needs of their children and grandchildren. But do you know what is the most curious thing? Mrs. Rosa did not complain. Like many grandmothers, she felt it was her duty to help her family. However, fatigue began to accumulate, and with it, a feeling of loss that she could not explain. This is where the famous slave grandmother syndrome comes into play. No, it's not the name of a new Netflix series, although it could very well be. This term, coined by Dr. Antonio Guijarro, describes the emotional and physical burden that grandmothers experience when assuming unpaid caregiver roles. Imagine this. You're on an emotional roller coaster. On the one hand, you love your grandchildren dearly and enjoy every moment with them. On the other, you feel like your life is slipping through your fingers while you change another diaper. It's like trying to hug a cactus, beautiful but painful. Studies show that this syndrome can have devastating effects on grandmothers' mental health. The lack of recognition, physical exhaustion, and loss of personal freedom can lead to depression and anxiety. It's like you're running an endless marathon, but no one is waiting for you with a medal at the end. Mrs. Rosa began to experience these symptoms. She felt increasingly tired, but she told herself that it was normal, that it was part of being a grandmother. But is it really normal to sacrifice your well-being for that of others? Spoiler alert, it's not. Psychologist Carol Gilligan talks about the care ethic and how women, in particular, tend to prioritize the needs of others over their own. Mrs. Rosa was living this theory firsthand, sacrificing her time, her energy, and without realizing it, her happiness. As the days passed, Mrs. Rosa found herself looking out the window more and more, longing for her former independence. She remembered the days when she could go out for coffee with her friends without having to ask permission or juggle schedules. Now, those outings seemed like an unattainable luxury. It's ironic, don't you think? Mrs. Rosa moved close to her children looking for company and closeness, but now she felt more alone than ever. As writer Paul Theroux once said, "Loneliness begins with family." Maybe she was right after all. Mrs. Rosa's story takes an unexpected turn. What began as a dream of family togetherness turns into a silent nightmare. Have you ever wondered how a decision made with love can take us down a path we never imagined? Lucia, Mrs. Rosa's daughter, begins to show her true face. One day, while Mrs. Rosa prepares lunch, Lucia enters the kitchen with a frown. "Mom, how many times have I told you that kids don't like onions? Why do you insist on putting them on everything?" The criticism falls like a bucket of cold water on Mrs. Rosa. This incident is not isolated. Little by little, suggestions become orders, and advice becomes reproaches. Mrs. Rosa feels how her space is reduced, how her voice is extinguished. Sound familiar? Maybe you have experienced something similar or know someone who has. Psychologist Erik Erikson, famous for his theory of psychosocial development, warns us about the importance of maintaining autonomy in old age. According to Erikson, the loss of independence can lead to an identity crisis and feelings of hopelessness. Isn't it ironic that by seeking support from our loved ones, we can lose something as valuable as our essence? Mrs. Rosa begins to feel the weight of this reality. Her days, once filled with projects and dreams, are now reduced to taking care of grandchildren and following instructions. Where was that woman who planned to travel and learn new skills? It fades under the shadow of other people's expectations. A study conducted by the University of Michigan revealed that older adults who maintain their independence report higher levels of life satisfaction. Amazing. Not so much if we think about how we would feel if someone controlled every aspect of our life. Frustration grows in Mrs. Rosa's heart. Every "you should do this like this," or "why don't you do it like I tell you?" It's a small splinter in your self-esteem. Resentment, that unwanted guest, begins to settle in the house that was once your refuge. One night, after a particularly difficult day, Mrs. Rosa finds herself crying silently in her room. The walls that once protected her now seem to close in on her. She feels trapped, worthless, like an old piece of furniture that no one appreciates, but that no one dares to throw away. How many of our elders will be living this drama in silence? The paradox is cruel. Seeking the warmth of family, Mrs. Rosa has lost the fire of her own identity. Closeness, which should be a balm, has become an invisible cage. How to get out of this trap? Is there a way to regain independence without giving up family love? Philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, "The purpose of life is to grow, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually." But how can Mrs. Rosa grow if she feels smaller every day in her own home? Get ready to discover how a lifelong friend turned Mrs. Rosa's life around with advice that challenges everything we think we know about aging and family. It was a day like any other when Carmela, Mrs. Rosa's lifelong friend, decided to pay her a surprise visit. With her characteristic smile and a bag full of freshly baked cookies, Carmela rang the doorbell, but what she found on the other side of the door left her speechless. "Rosa, is that you? You seem different," Carmela exclaimed, noticing her friend's dark circles and tired expression. Mrs. Rosa, trying to hide her exhaustion, invited her in with a forced smile. While they were sharing coffee in the kitchen, Carmela couldn't help but notice the unusual mess in her always impeccable friend's house. "Rosa, is everything okay? You seem a little off," she asked with genuine concern. And that's when the floodgates opened. Like an overflowing river, Mrs. Rosa began to confess everything. Her tiredness, her frustration, her feeling of being trapped in a life that she no longer recognized as hers. "You know, Carmela, sometimes I feel like I've lost my essence. I'm no longer Rosa, I'm just Grandma," she confessed through tears. "I love my grandchildren, but where was the woman who dreamed of traveling, who read novels until dawn?" Carmela listened attentively, nodding in understanding. When Rosa finished venting, her friend took her hands in hers and with a knowing smile said, "Rosa, dear, what if I told you that I went through the same thing and found a solution that changed my life?" Mrs. Rosa's eyes widened. "You? But you always look so happy, so free," she responded, incredulous. Carmela laughed. "Oh, but it wasn't always like that. Remember when my kids convinced me to move in with them? Well, after 6 months, I realized I was making the biggest mistake of my life." And so Carmela began to tell him her own experience. How, like Rosa, she had lost his independence, his hobbies, his essence. "But one day," she continued, "I remembered the words of philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, 'The only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be.' And I decided to be myself again." Mrs. Rosa listened fascinated as Carmela told her how she made the brave decision to move into her own apartment. "It wasn't easy," Carmela admitted. "My children didn't understand it at first. But you know what? Over time, our relationship improved. They no longer saw me as a burden or a constant babysitter, but as their mother, an independent and happy woman." "But Carmela," Rosa interrupted, "don't you feel alone sometimes?" Carmela smiled. "Of course, sometimes. But as psychologist Carl Jung would say, loneliness does not come from not having people around, but from the inability to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. And let me tell you, Rosa, that since I regained my independence, my conversations with my children and grandchildren are much richer and more meaningful." Carmela's words resonated deeply with Rosa. It was as if someone had turned on a light in a dark room, revealing a path I didn't know existed. "True happiness," Carmela continued, "comes from living on your own, maintaining a healthy balance between family responsibilities and taking care of yourself. Did you know that recent studies have shown that older adults who maintain their independence have better mental and physical health?" Rosa shook her head, fascinated by this new information. "Well, yes," Carmela stated. "A study published in the Journal of Gerontology found that older adults who live independently report higher levels of life satisfaction and lower incidences of depression. They even have stronger immune systems." Mrs. Rosa was silent for a moment, processing everything she had just heard. Finally, with a mixture of fear and excitement in her voice, she asked, "But Carmela, how do I start? I'm afraid of hurting my daughter, my grandchildren." Before continuing with the story, if you are liking the video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel with the bell so you don't miss future videos. And if you enjoy this type of content as much as I do, comment, "I love these stories." By the way, also comment on what you would like to see in the next videos. I read all your comments. Let's continue learning together and improving our lives. Carmela gave her hand a loving squeeze. "Rosa, dear, true love is not possessive. Your children will love you more when they see how happy you are being yourself. Start with small steps. Take up that painting course you always wanted to take. Go for a walk alone in the mornings. Little by little, recover your space. And so, with a cold cup of coffee in her hands and a heart full of new hope, Mrs. Rosa faced a challenge she never imagined, rethinking her situation and valuing her independence. Carmela's unexpected visit had not only brought him cookies, but also the seed of a new life. Mrs. Rosa was at an emotional crossroads. On the one hand, she loved his family with all his heart, but on the other, she felt like she was fading as a person. It was then when she remembered the words of the philosopher Seneca, "Life is long if you know how to use it." And she wondered, was she really using his life, or just existing? One morning, while making breakfast for her grandchildren, she had an epiphany. She remembered his passion for painting, which she abandoned some years ago. "When was the last time you held a paintbrush? I couldn't remember it." That same day, she decided to take a small step towards his independence. It started with something simple, a solitary walk in the park. At first, she felt guilty for not being home helping, but she soon discovered that that daily hour of solitude was like an oasis in the desert. During these walks, Mrs. Rosa began to reflect on her forgotten dreams and plan how to recover them. The next step was even bolder. She signed up for a painting workshop for seniors at the community center. "Oh my God," she thought, "what if I don't know how to paint anymore?" But as the famous painter Pablo Picasso would say, inspiration exists, but it has to find you working. And boy, did she find it. In the workshop, Mrs. Rosa not only rediscovered her passion for art, but also made new friends. Between brushstrokes and laughter, she realized that she had been living on autopilot, forgetting that life, at any age, is full of possibilities. A study conducted by Harvard University showed that maintaining independence in old age not only improves mental health, but can also increase life expectancy by up to 5 years. Mrs. Rosa was living proof of this. With each new activity, with each personal decision, I felt that I was rejuvenated, but not everything was rosy. There were days when guilt assailed her. "Am I being selfish?" she asked herself. It was then that she remembered her friend Carmela's wise advice. "You can't pour from an empty cup." Taking care of herself was not selfish. It was necessary to continue taking care of others. As Mrs. Rosa regained her independence, she noticed surprising changes. His energy increased, his chronic pain decreased, and his memory even improved. Dr. Oliver Sacks, famous neurologist and writer, used to say that the brain is the most incredible organ. It adapts, transforms, and remodels itself with each new experience. Mrs. Rosa was reshaping her brain and her life with each new adventure, but the most significant change was in his relationship with his family. Paradoxically, by spending less time with them, the time they shared became more valuable and meaningful. She was no longer the tired and complaining grandmother, but a vital woman with interesting stories that count. Finally, Mrs. Rosa gathered the courage to have a crucial conversation with her daughter. "I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I also knew it was necessary." As poet Maya Angelou once said, "There is no greater agony than carrying an untold story inside you." And Mrs. Rosa had a lot to tell. With her heart beating hard, Mrs. Rosa took a deep breath and sat down in front of her daughter Lucia. "Darling, we have to talk," she said with a trembling voice. Lucia looked at her curiously, without imagining what was to come. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Mrs. Rosa began, "and I think it's time for me to move into my own place." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucia blinked several times, as if trying to process what she had just heard. "But Mom," Lucia stuttered. "Why? Aren't you comfortable here? Did we do something wrong?" The concern in his voice was palpable, mixed with a hint of guilt. Mrs. Rosa smiled softly. "No, my love. You have been wonderful, but I need to rediscover myself to have my own space." She thought of the words of the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. The human being is condemned to be free, and she, at 70 years old, was choosing that freedom. Lucia's reaction went from surprise to confusion, and then to a mix of sadness and understanding. "But Mum, will you be okay alone? What if you get sick?" she asked, his eyes full of worry. Mrs. Rosa took her daughter's hands. "Look, Lucia, I'm not saying I'm going to disappear. I just want my own space to grow and enjoy this stage of my life." She recalled a study from the University of Michigan that showed that older adults who maintain their independence report higher levels of life satisfaction. "But what about the children? They love having you here," Lucia argued, clinging to the last reason she could think of. Mrs. Rosa smiled. "And I love being with them. But you know what? I think I'll be a better grandmother if I have time to myself. As writer Anne Morrow Lindbergh once said, the most exquisite of human pleasures is to be loved, but to be loved freely, with will." Lucia was silent for a moment, processing everything her mother had told her. Finally, with tears in his eyes, she nodded. "You're right, Mum. It's just, we're going to miss you a lot." "And I to you," replied Mrs. Rosa, hugging her daughter. "But think of all the delicious meals I'll make when you come visit me, without anyone telling me I'm using too much salt." They both laughed, relieving the tension of the moment. Family psychologist Dr. Maria Elena Rodriguez points out that these conversations, although difficult, are crucial to maintaining healthy relationships between parents and adult children. Open and honest communication can strengthen family bonds, even when it involves significant changes, she says. As the conversation progressed, Lucia began to see things from her mother's perspective. "I guess we all need our space," she reflected, "and you have dedicated so many years to taking care of us." Mrs. Rosa nodded, grateful for her daughter's understanding. "Exactly. And now I want to take care of myself. As the poet Rumi said, yesterday I was smart, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I am changing myself." Lucia smiled, a mixture of pride and nostalgia in her eyes. "Well, Mum, I guess we'll just have to help you find the perfect apartment. One with a kitchen big enough for all your secret recipes. And with a balcony for my plants," Mrs. Rosa added, her face lighting up with excitement. The day Mrs. Rosa crossed the threshold of her new apartment, she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Am I doing the right thing?" she asked himself. But as psychologist Carl Jung once said, "I am not what has happened to me. I am what I choose to be." And Mrs. Rosa had chosen to be brave. Decorating their new home became an unexpected therapy. Each object she placed was an affirmation of his identity. The colorful rug that she always liked, but that her daughter considered too flashy. The paintings of his favorite painters that now adorned the walls. She even dared to paint a wall a vibrant turquoise color. "Oh, if my Ramon could see me now," she laughed, remembering her late husband. But Mrs. Rosa's true rebirth began when she dared to step out of her comfort zone. She signed up for a gardening workshop at the community center. Plants and grandmothers. What a cliché combination. That's where he met Mrs. Consuelo, a widow with an acid sense of humor who soon became his accomplice in adventures. Together, they discovered the concept of active aging. It wasn't just about staying busy, it was about living with purpose. As noted by the World Health Organization, active aging allows people to realize their potential for physical, social, and mental well-being throughout their entire life course. Mrs. Rosa and Mrs. Consuelo decided to take yoga classes. The first session was a comical disaster. "I felt like a bad pretzel," Mrs. Rosa joked. But they persisted and soon noticed improvements in their flexibility and balance. More importantly, they were laughing like they hadn't in years. One day, while they were having coffee after class, Mrs. Consuelo said to her, "Rosa, have you noticed that we no longer complain about our ailments?" It was true. They were so busy living that they had forgotten about growing old. The Roman philosopher Seneca once said, "Life is like a play. It does not matter how long it lasted, but how well it was performed." Mrs. Rosa was determined that her second act would be the best. She dared more. She joined a book club where she rediscovered her love of poetry. She even dared to write his own verses, something she had not done since his youth. "The wrinkles on the paper are less noticeable than on my face," she joked to his new friends. But the most significant change was in his relationship with his family. Paradoxically, by having his own space, visits from his children and grandchildren became more special. They were no longer an obligation, but a shared pleasure. One Sunday, while her eldest granddaughter helped her water the plants on her small balcony, Mrs. Rosa realized something fundamental. Not only had she regained her independence, she was teaching the younger generations an invaluable lesson about aging with dignity and joy. The paradox of love teaches us that sometimes distance is the secret ingredient to strengthening the most important bonds. When Mrs. Rosa decided to move into her own apartment, many thought she was making a mistake. "How are you going to be alone at your age?" they told her. But she, with a mischievous smile, responded, "Alone? Now I have more social life than an influencer." And she wasn't exaggerating. The physical distance between Mrs. Rosa and her family turned out to be like an elastic band. As it stretched a little, the strength of the bond increased. Visits from his grandchildren became eagerly awaited adventures. They were no longer those monotonous afternoons in front of the television, but expeditions full of laughter and discoveries. One day the grandchildren arrived at their grandmother's house to find her in the middle of a giant canvas. "Grandma, you look like Picasso," exclaimed little Matteo. Mrs. Rosa, with paint even on her eyebrows, responded, "What's wrong? Picasso is too small for me. I am the great Rosasso." That afternoon, between strokes of brush and laughter, they created a family masterpiece that now hangs proudly in the living room. But it wasn't just visits that improved. Telephone calls, previously routine and short, were transformed into long and meaningful talks. As psychologist Carl Rogers would say, the good communicator listens not only with his ears, but with his eyes and his heart. And that is exactly what was happening in Mrs. Rosa's family. Mrs. Rosa's autonomy had a ripple effect on the entire family. Her daughter, Lucia, confessed, "Seeing Mum so independent and happy inspired me to return to my own dreams." It turns out that freedom is contagious, and Mrs. Rosa's example was sowing seeds of change in all her loved ones. A University of Michigan study revealed that older adults who maintain their independence report higher levels of life satisfaction and better family relationships. Mrs. Rosa was living proof of this research, and her experience was challenging stereotypes about aging. On one of her coffee afternoons with friends, Mrs. Rosa reflected, "You know, before I thought that loving meant being together all the time. Now I understand that true love gives room to grow." His words resonated with the wisdom of poet Khalil Gibran, who wrote, "Leave space in your union." The paradox of love that Mrs. Rosa discovered is that sometimes we need to move away to really get closer. As philosopher Erich Fromm once said, "Mature love says, 'I need you because I love you, I don't love you because I need you.'" Mrs. Rosa had gone from a suffocating dependence to a healthy, interdependent love. This new family dynamic not only benefited Mrs. Rosa, but everyone involved. The grandchildren now had two loving homes, the children felt less pressure and more gratitude, and Mrs. Rosa was flourishing in her new life. It was as if they had found the secret recipe for a happy family, and the main ingredient was, ironically, a little distance. Mrs. Rosa discovered that the key was neither living with her children nor completely isolated, but in an unexpected place between both extremes. As the Greek philosopher Aristotle would say, "Virtue lies in the middle," and Mrs. Rosa saw it firsthand. After his epiphany and his brave decision to regain his independence, she found himself in a new dilemma: how to maintain a close relationship with his family without sacrificing his newly regained freedom. The answer, as is often the case with the great truths of life, was simple but not easy: balance. Mrs. Rosa learned that the key was healthy interdependence, a concept that American psychologist Stephen Covey describes as the synthesis of independence and dependence. In practice, this meant for Mrs. Rosa setting clear but flexible boundaries. For example, she agreed to babysit her grandchildren 2 afternoons a week, but reserved the rest of the time for her own activities. "It's like juggling," she used to joke, "but instead of balls, I'm balancing love, freedom, and responsibility." This new approach had a surprising effect on the quality of time she spent with his family. They were no longer endless hours of routine, but special moments filled with laughter and genuine connection. As writer Mitch Albom once said, "Death ends a life, not a relationship." Mrs. Rosa understood that strengthening her relationships did not depend on the quantity of time, but on the quality. But the road was not without challenges. There were days when the guilt threatened to return, like a dark cloud on a sunny day. In those moments, Mrs. Rosa remembered the words of psychologist Carl Jung: "What you deny subjugates you. What you accept transforms you." So instead of denying his feelings, she accepted them and used them as an opportunity to reaffirm his decision. A study conducted by the University of Michigan revealed that older adults who maintain a balance between independence and family support are 30% less likely to suffer from depression. Mrs. Rosa was living proof of this statistic.